So, as Axel already introduced, I'm based at the National Center for Tumor Diseases in Dresden. Here, I'll show you a short introduction of the center. It's part of Helmholtz. I'm also part of the German Cancer Research Center in Dresden. They have also a site in Dresden, and the idea here is to combine engineering, computer science, and medicine. And at the center, we combine patient treatment as well as research. So it's all under one roof. We also have a really nice infrastructure. So you can see an experimental OR with all different kinds of robotic devices where we work closely together with clinicians and develop our intelligence assistance systems. And it mimics a real OR, so we can translate it directly into a real OR for clinical trials. It also has imaging platforms directly beneath the experimental OR. Okay, so my group in Dresden, it's an interdisciplinary group, and so there are computer scientists, engineers, but also clinicians, and we work on computer and robot-assisted surgery. And I will tell a little bit about today and the connection to digital twins. So first of all, I don't know if you knew that post-operative complications are amongst the leading causes of death worldwide. So there was a Lancet comment recently that shows that 4.2 million die within 30 days of surgery. And it is also shown that approximately half of these deaths are related to surgical errors. So there are also a lot of studies that show the more experience a surgeon has, the better is the patient outcome. So here you can see a study for complex cancer surgeries, and the more experience a surgeon has, the better is the patient outcome. Here you can see on the y-axis the mortality. So our basic question here is, how can we quantify this expertise and make it accessible to machines? There are things that a machine can do better, and there are things that a surgeon can do better. And if you look at directly into the operating room, you see these silos. So we have, for example, effectors. This is the operating team, but also robotic devices can be effectors. We have different kinds of sensors, for example, established sensors like a laparoscopic camera, which is mounted on the robot, or ultrasound, or we have the signals of the anesthesia, but we also have every now and then experimental sensors in the OR. Then we have the patient itself, meaning different kinds of heterogeneous patient data. This can be preoperative imaging data, but also the history of the patient, genomic data, lab data, and so on. And then we have knowledge, and this can be divided into factual and experience-based knowledge. So factual knowledge is what you can find in books, so how surgery is performed and so on. And experience, it's a bit more fuzzy, and this depends on the individual, and this is what we try to capture. And we try to combine these silos by using artificial intelligence. And we also started the Surgical Data Science Initiative. There are a lot of different universities and hospitals, and also industry is part of it, in order to define also ways to translate the things we develop in academia into the hospital. That you can see here, all different kinds of stakeholders are involved. Okay, what do I mean with assistance along the surgical treatment path? So I will focus here right now at intraoperative assistance, and this can be decision support and guidance. So, for example, during surgery to optimize surgical steps or to predict complications or to even have a robot system taking over some steps, for example, to do the suturing or knot tying. But we can also have preoperative assistance before surgery takes place. This can be a therapy recommendation based on the patient data or predicting the oncological outcome. Or post-operatively on the ICU, there can be also assistance function like based on the data we get in the ICU. But the assistance can also be provided by a remote expert, for example, when we look at telesurgery. So if we have an expert at a distant location who can jump in just for complex phases, or in the or for education. So the same methods we develop for decision support and guidance can be also used to educate young surgeons or medical students. So why do we need it at all? So in healthcare and especially in surgery, we have a tremendous lack of personnel already, which will even get worse in the next 10 years. So we need to find ways, how can we assist with machines during surgery? And here comes the digital twin into the scene. So there is a paper which was published recently about digital twins in the area of personalized surgery. And what does it mean, especially for surgery? I mean, you already heard during the lectures or the other lectures, what is a digital twin? But especially for surgery, there are several possible potentials and applications. So first of all, we have a physical surgical patient and we have a virtual replica. And the virtual replica consists, for example, of the patient geometry. We have, for example, preoperative CT or MRI data. It can involve genomic data or any other preoperative data we have, for example, laboratory values and so on. Then we have intraoperative data, and this captures the actual state of the patient. So we need a continuous bidirectional communication between our patient in the OR and our digital twin. And usually this is done by gathering sensor data intraoperatively. This can be done by using the endoscope or the laparoscopic camera, any additional sensors like ultrasound or a C-arm, or also taking the real-time physiological data we get, for example, from anesthesia. That is the basic concept, and what can be done, or what can be done with a digital twin. So first of all, we need to define what kind of digital twin we have for surgery. It can be a static twin. So we only have, for example, the patient geometry based on the imaging data. This can be used for preoperative planning, for example, or also for education. There are already a lot of systems which do that. So you have a virtual anatomical model or an atlas of a human where you can browse through the 3D organs and have in addition also the CT data or MRI data you can look at. You can have a functional twin, which means that you simulate biomechanical properties, for example, as you can see here on the right, and you can use it, for example, for outcome prediction. Then the next step would be to have a shadow twin. This can be done if you have sensors, for example, this intraoperative data I just mentioned. So you need some kind of sensors to update dynamically the status of the patient and the digital twin. So you have a communication between both. And this can be used for real-time guidance. I'll show several examples in the next slide. And then the next step would be an intelligent twin. So based on a shadow twin, for example, you use AI to predict events, for example, complication. You give individualized assistance depending on the context of the surgery and so on. So these are the different states we can have for a digital twin in surgery. And of course, the vision would be an intelligent digital twin, but we are not there yet in surgery. And I will show you now some examples. But we first start, and this is the basis for a digital twin in surgery, the data, especially in surgery. So how can we acquire surgical data? And this is not so easy as you might think because we need to record during surgery. And in Germany, there are only a few sites which record surgeries in clinical routine. So in Dresden, we do that. So we have an intraoperative recording where we capture every video that is done with the robot, with the Da Vinci robot. Or laparoscopically, for example, surgeries that are not done with the robot but minimally invasive. We also have an experimental OR you saw at the video in the beginning. And we record every experiment we do, but also real clinical data. We also not only do this for real surgeries, we also do this for training. So, for example, you can see here a box trainer, which is used for surgical residents, but also for medical students. They have a course and record their performance there. These are basic tasks, for example, like pick and place, as you can see on the left at the top, or cutting a balloon so that no water gets out, which simulates, for example, a gallbladder. And this is also recorded, not only the video, but also the trajectories of the instrument. But if we use artificial intelligence to build an intelligent digital twin, we still need annotation. And this is a major bottleneck. So annotation requires expert knowledge, maybe not for the image on the left. You can see where the instruments are annotated. I mean, I am not a clinician, but I can annotate instruments, and I'm sure you also can. But for example, the image in the middle here, it is not so clear if this is already a complication or not. It's a bleeding, but some bleedings are not complication and others are complications. Or on the right side, you see a dissection line, and this requires expert knowledge. And surgeons, they don't have time in a clinical routine to annotate this images or videos, and it takes 3 times the video length if you do this retrospectively. So the first question we need to answer is, how can we use smart methods to generate annotated surgical data? And one way to do this is, for example, to speed up annotation methods. And this can be done, for example, with active learning. So the idea is you annotate only a small amount of data, then you train your AI model, and you predict the uncertainty on the remaining data, and you select only the uncertain images. So where the model is not certain about the result. And these are like the complex images you also want to have in your training data. And then you only take this small amount and give it to the experts. So we did this in the Dresden surgical anatomy data set, which is the largest data set for Da Vinci surgeries or rectal surgeries. There are lots of images with different annotations. Each image was annotated by 3 annotators. It was merged and then again reviewed by an expert. And as you can imagine, this takes a lot of time and resources. It took like 3 years to get this data set only regarding the annotation. And this does not scale. So we need to come up with other methods. How can we get annotated surgical videos? And one way to do this is to use generative AI. So as you can see here on the right, this is a simulation of a patient. This is based on CT, MRI data. We create the 3D models out of it. But the simulation does not look realistic. And if you generate synthetic data, you have still a domain gap. So images from simulations, they usually do not translate well to real scenarios. So in one work, we used unpaired image-to-image translation to generate realistic synthetic data, as you can see here, the result in the bottom. So the idea is we have a simulated abdominal 3D scene. We do a simple rendering of the scene, as you can see here in the middle. And then we have a image-to-image translation. In this case, it was a diffusion model, and can create images with text prompts and one diffusion sampling step. And this gets us such translation results. It's unpaired. So on the left, we have the real image, then we have the simulated images, and here you can see the different steps of the diffusion model. And the big advantage here is that we already have the annotations because it's based on a simulation. We have the semantic mask and we do not need a manual annotation anymore. And the images, they look realistic. They can be mixed with real data to enhance our training data pool and use it for our networks. So you also see here other examples, and one thing I want to highlight is that the structure and content are preserved due to a special loss we integrated. Okay, so data and code is all available, but the next challenge is usually we work with videos, not with single images. So can we also generate synthetic videos? And if you use the same approach, you see that this does not work. You see here at the bottom that the background is flickering. So there are new structures coming up and then disappearing again, depending on the camera angle. So here you have no view consistency, and this is a problem. So you need semantic consistency in the video, but you also need the temporal consistency. And here we used a neural renderer. So we still have our simulated abdominal 3D scene, but then we have a neural renderer which learns the global representation of the texture. And then we can do an image-to-image translation, and we get videos, as you can see here in the bottom, and there are temporal and semantic consistent. So let's take a closer look at the method. As I already said, we have the abdominal 3D scene. Then we have a neural texture, which is the global representation. We do a simple rendering, but since we have a global representation of the texture, we can project it to the simple rendering. The core is still an unpaired image-to-image translation. And to enable view consistency, we have a second view, which is then warped in the first view. And we also integrated a special loss that mimics the lighting conditions in endoscopy. And if you use it, you can generate videos, as you can see here. But as you can see, these are still basic videos, so we don't have instrument tissue interaction, for example. We don't have soft tissue deformation. So right now, we are working on integrating these kind of interactions, but also adverse events, because this is not usually represented in our training data, complications, for example, which is good, but in the end, we need this data to detect or to predict complications based on our digital twin of the patient. So here we try to combine simulation with machine learning based approaches. Um, so as you can see here, you can use a generative AI. You already saw the image translation and the video translation. And here, a simple prompt using diffusion models. So the needle is passed from one grasper to the other. And if you look at the bottom, you see you get quite an output that looks quite okay, but still it's not temporal consistent. You also cannot control it quite well. So this is our current research topic. How can we use simulation-based approaches together with diffusion models, for example, to generate realistic scenes, but also have some control in these scenes. Okay. We not only generate synthetic data for videos, we also generate it for 3D applications. And this is a pipeline that is easy to set up. For example, you have pre-operative data, you can generate a scene setup, you can easily generate boundary conditions for the organs and also use material models from a simulation perspective. Then the pipeline does the meshing and the simulation. You can define what kind of deformations you want to integrate. You can add noise, for example, add additional displacements, extract only the surface or whatever you need for your application, and can calculate the displacement field. And we also use this 3D synthetic application for registration of pre and intraoperative data, and you will see some examples on where you can use this registration for navigation in the end in the next slides. Okay, I will start now with some applications, and the first one is decision support before surgery. So the basic idea here is, can we predict surgical complications or give the patient a risk score based on multimodal patient data? So the basic idea is we have different kinds of patient data. So CT, MRI images, maybe some histopathology images and so on. Preferably not only from one hospital, but from several hospitals, because we always need multicentric data so that our AI methods are robust and accurate and can also deal with the variances we have in certain hospitals. And then the idea is that we have a complication prediction framework that predicts, for example, the risk of an anastomosis insufficiency. Anastomosis insufficiency means that we have, for example, a leakage in a bowel. So we have the left and right bowel, which is sutured, and then there is a leakage, and which is very bad for the patient who has then a higher mortality. And we can try to detect this before and during surgery. And so one complication in pancreatic surgery is a pancreatic fistula. And some patients have a higher risk score of getting a pancreatic fistula after surgery. And you can predict this based on the CT data of the patient and the lab data. So you can see here CT images with different annotations. And we had data from Dresden we used to train our model, and the input was the CT and the clinical data of the patient. And we wanted to see if we can predict the risk of getting such a fistula. And we did an automatic segmentation of the data we had. So we extracted radiomic features, for example, the shape, the texture, and so on. And we validated it on an external cohort from Heidelberg. And we saw that we had quite good accuracy, which was similar to the intraoperative risk score. And the three main features that were important for the risk score were the shape, the texture, and the intensity volume histogram. Um, we also developed an easy-to-use web interface because it's always important that you can have also a human-machine interface to the clinician. Otherwise, it will not get uh, nobody will use it in clinical routine. And this is an example. You can upload the images, it's automatically segmented, and then you get a risk score for the patient. And if you know the risk score in advance, then you can take intraoperative measures so that the patient does not get a fistula after surgery. You can also predict complications intraoperatively, and here I have an example in robot-assisted esophagectomy. And the idea is that we have different intraoperative features. So, for example, what kind of instruments are used? Is there a bleeding? Is there smoke? And so on. Here we also use data from Dresden and Heidelberg. Here you can see the system running during surgery in the OR, so it's also real-time capable. And then you get a so-called report at the end where you can see what happened. So you quantify the usage, for example, of instruments and certain events. And the idea is then to use this with an app that was also developed and to predict a risk score after surgery. So when a patient is at the ICU, depending on the events that occurred. And if we can predict complications with it, this has to be proven because right now we are trying to do a clinical trial based on this system. So you saw there were some examples regarding decision support. How can we use preoperative data like CT or clinical data to predict complications, and how can we use intraoperative data to predict postoperative complications? And the next example I want to show you is guidance. And this is more along the lines of a shadow twin. So how can we use the preoperative patient data and the intraoperative data in order to guide surgery? And if you want to guide surgery, you have to do soft tissue registration. And here you can see an example in liver surgery. So we have preoperative data, CT images, as you can see here on the right. And we generate a 3D model out of it from the patient. And you see here the vessel tree inside the liver, but in yellow, you can also see the tumor. And during surgery, you only have this intraoperative view. So as a surgeon, you have a mental model that you project into this intraoperative view, and the outcome depends from the experience of the surgeon. So our goal is to use augmented reality to visualize these risk and target structures or what is inside the organ directly in the endoscopic view. And here you have some core issues. So you have your digital model of the patient, as you can see here at the top. And then you have the intraoperative view captured with videos, or as in this case, the laparoscopic camera as the sensor. And you need to align both. And first of all, the challenge is that you have no correspondences because here you have a 3D model and here you have an intraoperative video. Then you have deformations, which are not captured in your preoperative model. So because of instrument interactions and because of the pneumoperitoneum, which is a space that you create that you can operate minimally invasive, it deforms the liver. Then if you work in computer vision, you see that it's a textureless reflective surface. So if you want to find correspondences, it's quite challenging. Then in your preoperative model, you have also many unknowns. So for example, you don't know the material parameters of the liver. And if you look into the literature, you will find a wide range of material parameters. And then you also don't know the boundary conditions. So, for example, you don't know what is the pressure that is deforming the liver, for example. Another challenge is that you only have a small field of view intraoperatively, so max 30% are visible. And this also leads to ambiguities. And our goal was to create a data-driven biomechanical model to do the registration and in the end the navigation. So the idea was, can we use a neural network to predict the deformation? So can we learn somehow how an organ deforms? And here again, we need lots of synthetic data. We used the 3D application pipeline I showed you in the beginning. And then we tried to apply it to real patient data. And we only can use ready OR ready hardware, so we don't have a cluster in it or anything. So it also needs to be fast. And surprisingly for me, when we did it, it was some years ago, it worked, and it also worked for new patient data. But first of all, you need to do an initial registration, which means that you somehow need to align the preoperative data with the intraoperative video first. Not really accurately, but you need a starting point to then look at the deformation and how you can align the deformed surface. And this can be done by segmenting these landmarks, for example, in the 2D video and in the 3D model. And then you can use, for example, differentiable rendering to align both, as you can see here in the video. And this gives you a good starting point to perform the soft tissue registration or the continuous registration based on your deforming tissue. So the idea here of the continuous registration is you have your surface from the camera. How this is created, I will tell you in some minutes. And you have your preoperative model. You use only the geometry, and then you have a volume to surface registration network, which predicts then your displacement field, and you can align both in real time. So you know then where the tumor moved in the inside of the organ. And this has one advantage. It works directly on the geometry, so you don't need to know the correspondences between the pre and intra-op model. And it trains on random simulations. And one big advantage is that it adapts directly to any new patient geometry. So again, we used a lot of synthetic training data. We had random volume measures. So you can see this is not a liver. There was just random organ-like measures. We put random boundary conditions using an FEM simulation. Then we also had the intraoperative state. Here you can see this partial surface we can get from the simulation. This is represented as a signed distance field, and the output is then the displacement field. And we did it a lot of times, like 80,000 simulations. And that is the big advantage of using synthetic training data, because it's really difficult to get here real ground truth data from the operating room. And it already worked with these organ-like measures, so the network has never seen a liver. But if you then use sparse specialized data, for example, you put also some liver models into your synthetic training data, it gets even more accurate. And we did not only do it for liver, we also did it for breast or for kidney, and it worked quite well. So back to the intraoperative model we need. So in this case, we have a stereo endoscope, and which means we have a left and right camera inside the patient. And this is classical stereo view geometry. If you have left and right image, you can calculate a 3D model out of it. And this is then your intraoperative view. Here you can see it in a real surgery. It's not only calculating the surface, it's also calculating where the camera is located. So this is called simultaneous localization and mapping, which is also done in robotics usually, but here applied to an intraoperative scene. And here you have your intraoperative surface, which is then used to match it with the preoperative model. So the whole system now is meant like that. You have your preoperative model, you have your intraoperative scene, which you generate based on a 3D reconstruction, and then you can use a CNN-based registration. As you can see, we are no visualization experts, so we teamed up with groups. For example, we have a technical design group in Dresden who generate then these visualizations we try to integrate now in our system in order to get it to a clinical trial. We already have a trial here in navigation, but not for liver surgery, but for prostata surgery. So you can see here the intraoperative view and then the 3D model that is visualized inside the Da Vinci system with different methods. And the idea here is then that you can localize the nerves, for example, that should not be injured in the tumor directly in order to remove it more accurately. Okay. So my next part I want to talk about is context awareness. So the visualization or the augmented reality visualization I just showed, you don't want to see them all the time. It really depends on the context. So we want to provide the right information at the right time. So the robot or the AI system needs to know what is happening. And here we also use the video to detect the operating phase, as you can see here in the example. On top, you see the operating phase, and the application here is to predict the remaining time of surgery. Because OR is costly, and normally in the hospital, you have staff that is going around asking how long does it take or how long is the remaining time. But here we try to use video data to predict the remaining time. So from a methods point of view, we used the Bayesian neural network, and the input was also the video stream. We detected the phase, and the output was the remaining time. Right now, we have a clinical trial that is called Cobot. The idea here is similar. We have a neural network that is detecting the operating phase. You can see here the mobilization of the colon. And depending on the operating phase, an assistance is generated. So in the beginning, the visualization of the dissection plane, for example, or of the cutting or the insertion line, which is quite important at the beginning. But later on in surgery, it's important to visualize the dissection plane or also the visualization of risk and target structures. And we do a trial here now because the Da Vinci is a closed system. We cannot visualize something inside Da Vinci. So we have like a tablet beneath in the OR where the surgeon then sees the assistance and then can use it for performing surgery. What we also want to do is not only to detect the current phase, but also to anticipate events. And one example of anticipation was instruments. So if you have the video, can you anticipate when will the next instrument be used, based on the sequence we get from the laparoscope or the robot system? And not only which instrument, but also when the instrument will be used. And here we used an uncertainty quantification in a Bayesian neural network. So that means that we predict if and when an instrument is used. And here we identified trigger events. So for example, if a clipper is present, you have a high uncertainty that the scissor is the next instrument, for example. And of course, we not only want to anticipate instrument, but also adverse events or complications. But there we also need the training data, which brings me back to the generation of synthetic data, because usually in the videos we record, also in other hospitals or the videos you find publicly available, there are no complications or really few complications. That might also be the case, of course, because the surgeon is a really good surgeon, but at the other hand, there is also, I think, a reluctance in sharing your errors publicly. Okay, and then my last part takes a look at human-machine cooperation. And that one application I want to show you is data-driven objective training. I mentioned at the beginning, we are not only recording intraoperative data, but we are also recording training data from courses that are happening in the hospital. So for example, usually if you want to learn laparoscopic surgery, you have this kind of box trainer, as you can see here. So there is a box with some tasks inside the box, and the surgeon looks at the screen and operates with this really long instrument. So you have a difficult hand-eye coordination and so on. So in general, it's really difficult to handle and to learn. And then a mentor is standing beneath and giving some advice. So you can see that this does not really scale. And our idea was, can we use sensors to assess the performance of the students or the surgical novices? And can we also compare it with an expert model to give then targeted feedback? And the idea is that the students learn faster and they also improve their learning curve. So one example is to use the videos as you can see them here. This is the box trainer. We use sensors like the camera or markers at the instrument that can be then tracked to analyze what is happening. And there are standardized scores in laparoscopic surgery that score, for example, the tissue handling or the economy of motion. So you get a score from 1 to 5 in these different categories. So we acquired lots of data, we annotated the data, and then each performance gets a score and is also compared to an expert model. The newer version looks a bit more fancy. We also integrated gamification elements so that the students also like to use this training box. And the next step is then how can we use or give targeted feedback, because we are not only want to give a score at the end, we also want to give feedback during the performance. And here an example is haptic feedback. So we integrated also a haptic sensor inside the instrument. And once the instrument gets out of the view, which happens a lot, if you do this the first time, then you get an haptic feedback and how to put this instrument back into the scene. And here we are also working together with psychologists or learning psychologists and we try to look into what kind of feedback is good to improve the learning curve. So it can be visual feedback, or it can be haptic feedback, or audio feedback, and so on. The next part is an human-machine interaction. So how can we enable an intuitive human-machine interaction? And one example is a camera guidance. So you can see here a robot arm in our experimental OR where we mounted a laparoscopic camera on the robot. And the camera or the robot steers the camera independently, depending on the phase of the surgery and the best view. So here again, we collected a lot of training data, and the surgeon then can operate with this system independently. Of course, there are also mechanisms like a foot pedal to stop the robot and so on. But in general, it works quite well in this experimental setting. The next step is then to transfer it to a more realistic setting with, with soft tissue. On the right side, you can see a similar setup. Also, a camera is mounted here on the robot arm, but then the surgeon wears a VR glass because we have a stereo camera and sees the left and right image, and then can steer the camera based on the head movements. So again, here you don't need an assistant. So the robot arm can take over, and you can steer it directly, but still have an immersive view because you see the left and right camera. And the next step is then to enable a remote surgeon to join for complex phases. And I'll show you in the next video also an example. And this is a remote surgery example where we have, sorry, I'll try to where we have our experimental OR. Here you can see the robot arms and a lot of sensors that the surgeon wears. Here is the remote surgeon. He has a data glove, for example, and can steer the robot arm in the OR. But also give telementoring advice, as you can see then here. So, for example, where to cut and also taking over the instruments. I try to pause it so that you see it in a bit more detail. So you can see here, we have the two robot arms where two instruments are mounted. The surgeon wears a sensor suit, so you know how to move. We have the laparoscopic camera with the room camera. So lots of sensors to capture the state of the patient and the surgeon. And then you can take over the instruments from a distant point of view, as you can see here. Also here the surgeon wears a data glove, and we built a digital twin of this whole operating setting, including the patient and the surgeon with all the robots, with all the sensors we have in the OR. And then, as I said, the assistance is based on different kinds of, starting from telementoring to taking over the instruments. Here you can see the real-time digital twin we create from the glove, the sleeve, the surgeon wears, the camera, and so on. And then we also have some network data because we have a remote expert joining, which can then give advice. We also use this digital twin for education purposes. For example, here is a so-called walkable operating room where everything is captured in 3D. So you can walk around with a VR glass and use it for education purposes, for example. We also use this digital twin for automation tasks. So we started here in our test bed to automate, for example, a thread in a hole tasks or up to suturing. So we can generate again lots of simulated data in our simulation environment. In this case, we generate robot movements, and then we can, for example, use reinforcement learning to automatize these tasks. Okay, so at the end, I also want to talk about remaining challenges, also regarding translation. And one big challenge, as I already mentioned in the beginning, is data. So in surgery, it's not so easy to gather the data because you need to record the surgeries. Not only the videos, preferable also the data from the robot or from anesthesia and so on. And a lot of hospitals don't have the hardware and the resources to record the data. Then we need data that is representative for the task and without any bias from multiple centers. It's heterogeneous data, so it's not only a single CT or MRI images. These are long videos with a lot of variances. And we also have to take patient privacy and security into account. Then we have the methods challenge. I mean, foundation models, as we can see it right now in the state of the art, they are quite powerful, but for surgery they do not work well yet. Let's see. So we need to have methods that can deal with these kind of heterogeneous data. There was a paper published recently where a robot was doing parts of a cholecystectomy in a lab environment, a user vision language action model, which was quite impressive. So I think we are slowly getting there, but we still need to annotate the data or at least parts of the data. And right now, the methods are also a black box. And if we want to use it in healthcare, this is a problem. We need explainable methods that can be also somehow certified. Then we need to integrate it into the surgical workflow. Preferable, we need access to the devices in the OR, which is also not so easy. You need to integrate industry stakeholders and work with them together so that they give you access to the interfaces. And then it's really important in the end to also do clinical studies. So because we also want to show that the things we are developing here really make a difference for the patient. And this can be also only shown in clinical studies. And in Germany, it's quite challenging to do a clinical study because of all the regulatory requirements we have. So the study I showed you at the beginning, it took us now 2 years to get all the regulatory stuff through the authorities and to start with the study. And a company, for example, they have several people who are doing that, but in research, you usually don't have the resources to do that. Okay, so the OR of the future is a sensor-based environment where you can enable several assistance systems, starting from context-aware visualization to complication prediction to semi-automation of certain tasks. And the basis for doing that is a digital twin. We saw that we have static twins, we have functional twins, we have shadow twins, which are very important here for guidance. And in the end, the vision is to have an intelligent twin so that you can also predict events and simulate if you do certain actions, then the outcome will be better or worse, for example. Of course, this kind of research is only possible in an interdisciplinary context. So here are my clinical key collaborators I want to thank, and of course also my PhDs and postdocs whose work I'm presenting here. So thanks a lot for your attention.